Hello again and welcome back to another episode of Flipped, where I take soulful samples and turn them into hip-hop instrumentals for us to all vibe to. My name is Kyle, but I make music under the name Bat. If this is your first time here, welcome. Big shout out to you. Thanks for pulling up. Today we're going to take a sample that I made called Mayest and turn it into a beat called Smooth Operator. Let's get it. So some weeks back, I made a sample called Thou Mayest. It's a soul sample that leans a little bit R&B. So I put this sample together using a few of my favorites, a few of my go-tos, my Rhodes, my bass, and a couple different VSTs. One for an electric guitar, one for an acoustic guitar, and one for like an old Casio synth lead. Now, if you want to see piece by piece how I compose a sample, make sure to check out this video. All right, let's take a listen to the sample. This particular series is all about flipping samples, so this is the point of the video where we take the sample that I just played you and we flip it upside down. But before we get into the full flip, let me show you how I messed around to kind of come up with the idea. So the first thing I did was I pitched the sample up a few semitones. After pitching the sample, then I chopped it into quarter note increments. I want to say something about that real quick. So chopping samples is an art form. Like it's not random. I mean, sometimes it can be, but for the most part, there's usually like a method to the madness. I'll speak for me and say sometimes I do want the sample to be unrecognizable. So I'll chop it up into really fine fragments so that when I play it back, you can't really tell what the sample even is. And then there are other times where I want to use the sample to create something new while also still keeping it familiar to the listener. The idea is that like when they hear it, it'll kind of snap them into place like, oh, I've heard this before. In meme form, the reaction I'm trying to create is that Leonardo DiCaprio meme where in that one movie, he's sitting on the couch and he kind of like snaps into place, right? This is an easy way to take the sample, recontextualize it while still keeping it familiar because it's chopped up enough to create something new, but you're still leaving enough of it intact so that at various parts it's still recognizable to the listener. So after pitching the sample up and chopping it, I start playing around with different patterns to kind of just throw ideas out there and see what sticks. And usually after a while, I'll land on an idea that I think is a really good starting place. But as I told you last week, I don't like to record my idea right away, which I know is kind of weird, but it is for the best, I promise. For most of my beats, I like to build the drums first. Drums are chiefly responsible for how I want my track to feel. And so laying them down first helps me really kind of set the right foundation, set the right movement, the right vibe before I get into any other instruments. And this way, when I go back and I replay the sample on top of the drums, I know I'm gonna get a better performance. So with that in mind, we move over to the drums. I programmed these drums using a couple loops and a couple one-shots. I'll replay it for you and introduce everything one at a time so you can kind of hear how we got to where we are. Let's start with the kick. Now, what I like about these drums is the snap on the backbeat. At different points, it kind of feels like the snare is kind of like snapping everything back into place. And this sort of feel usually comes from delaying the kick, pulling it back just slightly off the grid, and then taking the snare and pushing it just in front of the grid. I also love that the percussion loop is giving it some character. The paper shaker is kind of seesawing the groove back and forth, and the whole thing is kind of being held together by those 16th note hats. So now that we got the drums locked in, we can go back over to our sample and start recording the idea that we came up with earlier. Before we even chopped it up, the sample was just already kind of smooth. The drums are also smooth. They're not doing anything like overly destructive or rhythmic. They're just kind of, it's kind of riding. So we're going to look to keep the flip in the exact same sort of vein, just real smooth. Let's take a listen to how it sounds. I'm feeling really good about everything at this point. The drums and the sample are definitely made for each other, but there is more to explore, so I added some additional sounds, specifically some vocal chops. But let's adjust the format so it sounds like two voices are singing an octave apart. Nice. That should give it some humanity and some lift. Now that everything is in place, it's time to pull it all over into my DAW and start kind of getting a polished or not so polished mix. Mixing is a really involved process, and diving into every component of it might make this video a bit unbearable. But there is one thing specifically that I do want to highlight, and that is sidechain compression. Just from a technical standpoint, even outside of hip hop or dance music, sidechain compression is a really good tool to have in your arsenal whenever you're doing any genre of music, whenever you're mixing two or more audio sources. And let's do it like this. Let's say you're having a get together at your house and it's just you and two of your friends. And at the moment, y'all are just kind of chilling, talking, kicking it. And of course, these are your friends, so everyone's showing decorum. Everyone's kind of taking their turn to talk. But even if you talk over each other, everyone can still hear and be heard. But there's a ring at the doorbell, and 3 more friends show up, which is really exciting, but the conversation gets a little louder. The discipline of not talking over each other gets a little more difficult. But for the most part, everything is still fine. I mean, you can still hear everyone. You just can't hear them quite as well, and you have to listen a little bit harder. And then the doorbell rings a second time, and this time 4 more friends show up. Now it's a party. People are not only talking over each other, but we got different people in different parts of the room and having side conversations. There's a lot happening at one time. In order to hear yourself, you have to talk louder. And in order to hear whoever you're talking to, you have to ask them to speak up. Mixing is a lot like this. The more instruments there are in the room, the louder things tend to get, and the more difficult it's going to be to hear everything. Technically speaking, mixing is just taking a few different audio sources and routing them all through to come out of a single left and right stereo channel. With that in mind, the more audio sources you have in a mix, the less clear you're going to be able to hear everything. Now, there are obviously a few different ways to remedy this. Of course, you can and should use tools like EQ to shape your sounds and make room for each instrument. You should also use things like saturation to kind of subtly sharpen and distort your sounds to make them more prominent in the mix without turning up the volume. And then there's sidechain compression. Sidechain compression is dope because when 2 things are being heard at the same time, it's a way to kind of give priority to one of those things. Like, hey, I'm talking, you be quiet, and then when it's your turn to talk, I'll be quiet. Some producers also refer to this as ducking because you're ducking one instrument behind another. And a lot of mix engineers, when mixing any number of genres, use sidechain compression in a very, very subtle way. Like if you wanted to just bring a lead vocal more forward in a mix, you might sidechain all the other instruments to the vocal so that when the vocal steps up to speak, everybody else kind of quiets down. Now, if you've spent any time making beats, you know the benefit of sidechain compression in hip hop. It is an essential. Now, I couldn't really tell you who started it or when it started, but in hip hop production, we've kind of taken this concept and pushed it way out to the boundary. And let me be clear, other genres do this as well. This is not just a hip hop thing. What became really popular some years back is to take this sidechain compression, push it all the way, and it'll create sort of a really dope effect. Some people call it pumping. I kind of like to call it breathing. It sounds like a breathing effect to me. So for this particular beat, I'm sidechaining the sample and some of the extra layers like the vocal chops to the kick drum. This way, every time that kick hits, the sample ducks a little bit and then comes back, creating a sort of breathing effect that makes the beat feel a little more dynamic and alive. I'm going to show you what it sounds like with no sidechain compression. Then I'll show you what it sounds like pushed all the way to the max. Then we're going to dial it back to my taste for this track. Here's what it sounds like with no sidechain compression, aka my porridge is too cold. Here's what it sounds like with heavy sidechain compression, aka my porridge is too hot. And here's where we dial it in. My porridge is just right. So we're almost done. The mix is in a really, really good spot. And as I showed you last week, this is where I go and I add some final touches to the mix bus. A little EQ, a little stereo width, some saturation, some compression, and finally some leveling. All small adjustments, nothing too crazy, just enough to give it a little polish. And that is it. To me, this was a bit of an interesting one because of how I played the sample. How I'm playing it is a little bit of a shorter subdivision than where the sample is originally, so it makes it kind of fun and odd. It gives this weird little rhythm to it. The acoustic guitar in the sample also keeps it pretty R&B authentic to me. The drums are smooth and ride along with the sample very well. I mean, if you know me, then you know I love this feel on the hats. 16th notes, very Gatson-like, very Purdy-like. Then the vocal chops give it a little bit of life, a little bit of lift, especially at the end of the loop. So here we go. I'm going to hit play, let the track take us out. And while the track's rolling, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. And of course, if you feel like it, drop me a comment. All right. I'll see you next time.